Hey, it's Craig. I just wanted to let you know that you can listen to Canadian History X early and ad-free on Amazon Music, included with Prime. Greetings and welcome to another episode of Canadian History X. Today on the podcast, I'm interviewing Andy English from the Headley Boys podcast. Now, when I look at Canadian history and we look at the First World War, I tend to take kind of a broader look at it. I look at the battles. I might mention certain officers who maybe wrote letters home when I'm quoting them, or somebody who got a medal, but generally I'll say 5,000 people died in this battle. But there's stories to each of those individuals, and that's what I like about the Headley Boys podcast, because it looks at the men from Headley, British Columbia who went overseas and fought. So it gives us a personal look to those soldiers who fought in the First World War, and Andy English does a fantastic job of it. Now, I do have to mention that we had a little bit of trouble with the Zoom interview. For some reason, my audio wasn't being picked up properly, so my questions may seem a little bit stilted, and that's because I had to record some of them afterwards, and then he would respond to them. We actually had to I sent the questions through chat and he'd respond to them. So hopefully it doesn't sound too weird, but I hope you enjoy it. So let's just get to our interview with Andy English from the Headley Boys podcast. So the cenotaph is one of the oldest in Canada, you mentioned on the podcast. Is that what sparked the idea for the show?
Well, the cenotaph, that was the age of it was something we discovered later on. We knew it was old. I remember the whole thing started, it was Remembrance Day back in probably 2013. And the pastor was he had forgotten his paper and he was struggling to read the names off the cenotaph because they're in lead letters and they'd been picked off so much over the years. He couldn't read them and it was such a shame. And so I was a member of the museum and I said, I'd like to maybe do some research and more on the men and see if there were any men that weren't, recorded on it. And so I started doing this project, and one of the museum directors, Jennifer Douglas, came on board and was able to, go through the museum records. And luckily the Headley Gazette we have copies, but it's also digitized online now. So that made that research gave us somewhere. And then the army records. So it started as a project to get the cenotaph restored. But while we were doing it, of course, we found a lot of other information, particularly that story of 17 men and boys on one day going to war, all leaving Headley, and they all stood right outside where the cenotaph is now. The photographer is standing on the spot the cenotaph stands on, and he took the photo of these men. And 5 of those men didn't come back. They're on that cenotaph. So we had a reunion on that date, the 100th anniversary. Managed to track down quite a number of relatives of a number of these men who went to war, as well as some of the other Headley men, and all attended this reunion. And again, most of the families, of course, were unaware of it. They didn't know the significance of, the fact being this relative. This is what he did. He was a part of a big group of men that all joined up. And we had this reunion, and we even had the great nephew of the man who signed their attestation papers into the army. Richard Lucas, whose great uncle was their CEO, Travis Lucas, as well as relatives of Alec Jack and all these other men. And it was just fascinating to hear the stories being swapped. And of course, it kindled a lot of interest with them. So more information came out. And then we raised enough money, generous donations through them and through Veterans Affairs. And we got the cenotaph restored and these 2 men added to it. But of course, during the research, we found, it was in the Headley Museum, there was a letter from Alec Jack written in 1966 talking about this 47-year-old monument. Well, he was a banker. If it's 47, it's not nearly 50. It's 47 makes it 1919. And I know that's old. The cenotaph in England wasn't unveiled until, they were building the cenotaph here in August of 1919, less than a year after the war finished. And they didn't even call it a cenotaph. It was War Monument to the Fallen. That was what it was originally called. But so we had that unveiled in 2017. And then by then, I've got to admit, myself and Jennifer, we were pretty burnt out and, personal life and everything. So we took a break. But I always wanted to come back, and I always had this real itch to find out more about what happened to these men. And again, the army records weren't all available at that point. They were releasing them, in blocks if you've been, studying army records from the First World War, but a lot of them were just not available still. So of course they came out in the preceding couple of years, and so I went back over it again. And yeah, I mean, I read the Headley Gazette pretty much cover to cover a couple of times, and got to know all these different things, and went back over all the soldiers' records, and just tied the bigger picture together, about how these men, yeah, I mean, what they did after as well. And we're lucky to have this, this collection of information with their letters and things that are in the Gazette, and, the different family things that have come through, and all these forgotten tales of these men.
What was the research process for the show, and was it easier or harder than you envisioned?
Yeah, I mean, like I say, a lot of the research had been done beforehand. We did a museum display, and then for the cenotaph restoration, and wrote a couple of articles. But again, it was really with this over the last winter. I've been off work anyway, with different injured shoulder and things. So it gave me a chance to actually sit down. And then COVID happened as well, which was the perfect. But I wanted to do a talk. That was the idea. I was going to do a slideshow lecture with a lot of this information that's come about, and just like I say, tying the big picture, because we'd always focused on the men who were killed, and it was like, to me, there's a lot of the men, they came back, and they've got a story. They still served as well, and it was trying to tie all of this together. And it was originally going to be this slideshow lecture for perhaps 20, 30 people in Headley, and of course it got cancelled. And someone said, well, why not do a podcast? And again, the idea would be I was just going to start doing my talk, but after about 5 minutes, I realized that was just not possible to sit there and just talk it. So yeah, I ended up basically having to write everything. So everything you hear is all scripted, and yeah, I busted it out, just going back through, using the notes, the letters that myself and Jennifer had transcribed back and research, and just going back in and yeah, just piecing their story together and giving more flesh on it, I suppose.
What has the response to the show been overall?
I mean, I don't know, it's my first podcast, so maybe you know more than this. I mean, it's like, yeah, my friends and family, oh, it's really good, I really like it. So how many episodes? Well, I've only listened to the first 5 minutes, but it sounds really good, and I'm going to listen to it later. It seems to be a lot of that. But again, yeah, I have had people in town come up to me totally unexpected, and just, who I barely know, and have said, oh, I really enjoy your podcast. I do a lot of driving, and I've been really enjoying it. So, I've had a little bit of feedback like that, which is nice. I mean, again, originally the idea was it was just, it's a Headley, but of course, as I learned more of the story and what these men did, and tied it in more with the Canadian history of the war, that's, again, they did play a big part. And for such a small town, these men were everywhere. The very, very first battles involving Canadian soldiers, there were men from Headley. And the very last battles, there were men from Headley. And they were in every battle in between. And, for such a small town, I mean, again, I did the, breakdown. It was like, there's 58 men who joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. 44 of them ended up serving at the front. 11 were killed. That's 1 in 4.
Yeah.
The Canadian average was 1 in 10. So again, it gets pretty brutal for these men, and nearly every other one of those men was wounded and spent time in hospital. And again, a large number of them were wounded so bad they were out of the army. So it was really harsh. And again, it's the when I was looking, their later lives, some of their records, again, in the military records, if they die in a military hospital, it has their date of death. So many of them died in the 1940s and the 1950s. Very, very few of them were around for the 50th anniversary, and even the young men, they died young. It's, we're used to the war, First World War veterans lived into the 21st century, They were some of the oldest men who had ever lived, but, we don't like it. But the Headley boys, they were all gone by the 1970s. They were the men who really fought. These were the guys who lived in the trenches. These were the men who breathed the gas, who came home with the limps, with the gammy arms and everything else. But they were the ones, who were everywhere. And like I say, they played quite major roles in a lot of different things. And yeah, for such a small little town in the in the middle of nowhere almost, but because of this mine, it attracted these people. I mean, there was men from Australia that came to Headley, and ended up joining up from here, and so it was really representative, I think, of the Canadian Army as a whole as well.
Do you feel that the war being over 100 years ago, that some of the stories have been lost to history?
Yes, I do, and I do feel the stories are being lost. And again, I with these men, I mean, all their families I spoke to, they didn't know these stories. These men didn't talk about it, and it's not surprising. I mean, what they went through. How do you tell that to your kids? How do you tell that to your wife? I spent a night sitting on top of a dead guy. I ate my breakfast next to a rotting corpse, and how do you explain these? Or and the stories of your friends being killed. It's like any war, but again, I think the First World War in particular, and they got to the point where I think perhaps they were comfortable of talking about the war, and then the Second World War happened, and then the First World War is just absolutely consigned to history. It just becomes this thing that the lions led by donkey myth, and everything else that the men had ever done is is forgotten. And the thing as well, it's like the next generation, they're the generation that's referred to as the greatest generation. Well, what about this generation? Wow. I mean, these are people who grew up riding horses and carts, finished, flying aeroplanes and all sorts of things, lived through the pandemic, the depression, then had to send their kids off for another war, knowing what war was all about. And then their kids are the greatest generation, so again, I do think their stories were totally lost. I think very much the First World War, until this centenary's come around, I think it's been so neglected and so overtaken by the Second World War. And to me, the First World War, I think in a way, certainly from Britain, from Canada, was a much more important war. And they played much more significant roles. The casualties were much higher. Again, people don't realize how many Canadians were killed in that war. And yeah, I mean, our monument has 13 men from the First World War. It has 4 from the Second World War. And way more men served in the Second World War from this town. It was a bigger town and a lot more men went. But again, the casualties were much, much smaller. Yeah, the First World War, their stories, they have been lost. And the thing is, in the paper, there are these letters that they write from the front. They write them while they're resting up on the march down from one battlefield to another. They're writing, these experiences are fresh in their mind. They're writing from their hospital bed, recovering from absolutely horrendous injuries. Yet they're writing to their friends in Headley. They're trying to keep their chin up. But it's the fact that so many of these letters always end with, "Give my regards to everybody in Headley. Remember me to my friends in Headley." And, this little town in the middle of nowhere, for these guys, they came from all over the world. They're not thinking about their hometown. They're thinking about here. This is now their home. And the fact being, so many of the men who did survive came back to Headley. I mean, there was then a bit of a depression and recession in the town, and a lot of the jobs went. And of course, a lot of these men moved on. But a significant number, they came from the other side of the world. They came all the way back. They didn't stop anywhere else in Canada. They came straight back to Headley. And I think that says a lot, a lot for this feeling that they had, and they called themselves the Headley Boys. And, there was this band of brothers, I suppose, this camaraderie. And again, I imagine it was only ever shared amongst themselves. A very small group of them would have been able to share this. And their voices were silenced many, many years ago.
How many episodes in total is the entire series?
There will be 9 episodes for the entire season. That's just how it seemed to naturally break down into that. So I'm just working on, as we record this, I'm actually working on my 9th and last episode right now. So there are 8 episodes out at the moment. And I'm working on a website as well that will tie in with it, headleyboys.com. Again, because, I want anybody who's interested in this podcast, I want to find out more. A lot of these men, we still don't know, lots about them. Some of the men, the idea originally was to have photos of every man who was killed. Well, there's some of the men we still don't have identifiable photos. The archives in the museums are wonderful archives. They've got lots of photos, and they've got a number from that period, and there's some good group photos. And the chances are some of these men are in those photos, but we just can't identify them. We don't have another photo that says, for instance, this one is Thomas Calvert. We don't know what he looked like. I know from his military records he has a ballerina tattoo on his right arm, but that doesn't help us with the Headley photos. But again, it's one of these, if we can find something where it says an identifiable photo, then we can use that to find more photos, which we did with Alec Jack. We didn't realise we had about 4 photos in the Headley archives with Alec Jack playing golf. It's like these famous photos that are on display in the museum are of this golf party. Turns out it was Christmas Day 1919. Just after the cenotaph had been unveiled, and Alec Jack's back in town, and he's having his round of golf on Christmas Day, and nobody knew. And then his grandson turns up, and he's got another photo from the collection, all signed by Alec Jack with who else is in it. So again, it's like these men were there, and that was the other. I've got just one of these little Headley quirks. When we were doing the cenotaph meetings and the committee meetings, we were like meeting in the media room with all the files and the photographs. And found this, this letter that mentioned the 3 cenotaph committee members, Alec Jack being one of them, Tommy Knowles, who ended up as the postmaster, and this other man called Joe Rotherham. Well, through doing the research and finding other photographs of them, it turns out all 3 of those men were in photographs in that room, looking down on us at the same time. And it was just like, okay, we're passing that torch on. Because again, this Headley, it's one of these places where it's just the unexpected happens. And these weird coincidence. When I recorded the music, Maple Leaf Forever, I recorded it in the Grace Church. And I used to be current pianist and moved to town a few years back, and she loves her history and had researched the original, one of the old pianists, Ina Knowles. And she had married one of the Headley boys, Tommy Knowles, in that very church, on the very 7th anniversary of the day that these men had all joined up, this big group of men. And I'm telling Cindy this, and I said, so their family actually ended up using that date as a wedding date. And I said, the 24th of August. And she looks at me and she goes, that's mine and Terry's wedding. And it's just like, and this is in the same church that was the chapel that stood there since 1903. And most of these men, this is their church. And that some of those men, their last night in Headley, they were in that church praying before they left to go serve. And that was the moment. Yeah, it's still even now, those guys, they're there still. And I suppose it's for them we're doing it for.
How many episodes in total is the entire season? You mentioned in the show many stories, but the beginning, Vimy Ridge and beyond. Any favorites from the show?
Yeah, I think it's a favorite. Yeah, I mean, I think the most impactful, I think, to me is the Vimy Ridge, but not necessarily, both the attack, but also the trench raid, because it's so little known. And the more research I've done on that, I mean, Tim Cook, the superb Canadian historian, wrote an excellent article on it called A Frightful Slaughter, I believe. And it is just chilling what, they knew how bad it was going to go. And there was just no good reason to do it. I mean, just none. I mean, at that point of the war, nobody was using gas cylinders. The Germans had as good a gas protection as anybody. It was just... just one of these things that should have been canned. I mean, but there's almost a Blackadder, horror in it, where these guys, they, from the top down, they keep going all the way up, the lieutenant colonels. This is crazy. The Germans know. They caught prisoners who told them this. They knew that attack was coming. We're ready for you, Canadians. Come on over. And they still, General Ironside, it is Edmund Ironside. He ended up as the commander of the home forces in charge of all the Canadians in the Second World War, ironically. But at that point, he basically said, no, go ahead and do it. And so 3 battalions were just sacrificed in 15 minutes for no reason.
Yeah.
And it's an unknown Canadian story. It's eclipsed 6 weeks later. There's the triumph at Vimy Ridge. Well, this was absolute chaos. And I mean, it really hampered the whole Vimy Ridge operation. I mean, they've got 3 battalions, you know, the 11th Brigade, who's been blown to pieces, and now they've got to rebuild them. They've got to rebuild the men, they've got to rebuild the morale, and then get them up. Oh, and you still got to take that bit of ground, which you just got slaughtered on, and it's the toughest bit of the whole ridge. To me, it was crazy. And I compare it to Dieppe, and, you know, Dieppe was a bigger scale, but again, I don't think there was anything until that where, you know, you knew these guys were going to get killed. And there was, you know, no reason to do it. Absolutely zero. It achieved nothing. And again, if more Canadians know that story, to me, that's an important, often forgotten. And it cost the lives of 2 Headley boys.
Yeah.
You know, they both died of wounds received that night. And there was no other action where 2 men were killed in one engagement. So, yeah, I think that's the one that, to me, the most personal, because again, when I first read about it, it's just shocking, you know, especially at that stage of the war, and what you read about and how prepared the Canadians were supposedly at that point, and to go ahead with that, it's upsetting. I think if you read that in its entirety, it is brutal to know that happened to Canadians, and it shouldn't have.
Do you have any plans to make a season 2 for the podcast?
I know, a season 2 at the moment. I mean, I'm just concentrating on getting this one finished. I mean, there's certainly more letters and stories and different things. And like I say, I want to get this website up and running and see what comes in, what I can bring in from that. Because there's photos out there. We know when the recruits, we've got one photo of the 17 recruits lined up outside the bank on the 24th of August. But we know more photographs were taken. The town photographer, his brother, was one of the men joining up. So he took a lot of photographs. We know there are photographs of the men leaving the town in the trucks with a banner proclaiming recruits from Headley, the machine gun town. I'd love to see one of those photos. You know, I'd love to find some more of these stories of some of the other men. So, a season 2 on that, maybe focus on some of the battles they fought on as well. Because again, you know, due to the nature of the podcast, I don't want to go too heavy on the military and everything else. But again, it'd be nice to perhaps a little bit more depth on 1 or 2 of the battles that they were quite heavily involved in, and, you know, give a little bit more information on that sort of thing. So maybe something like that, or find some interesting people to interview and talk to and do some interviews.
The last question, how can people find the show?
Okay, so I'm on the Buzzsprout hosting service, but my podcast, I'm on every platform now. So if you get Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, any of those ones, as well as History Pods, which I think is a really good. If you like history, it's an excellent site. There's podcasts on every topic, and I'm really proud to be on it. And I will say, since I've been on it, my audience has absolutely shot up. I'm reaching people on every continent now, at countries all over the place. And I'm just thrilled people are listening and finding out about Headley and the Headley boys. Because to me, we're a small town in the middle of BC, in the middle of nowhere almost, but we really did play a big part in that Great War. We really did, you know, and the fact being it stands to this day on its same spot is one of the very oldest cenotaphs in all of Canada. And again, I would like to know for sure. The oldest I found in Alberta was 1920, and it got moved. I've not heard of any that are older. So again, if anybody knows of a cenotaph somewhere that was erected before December 1919, be nice to know about that. But again, it's on this historic spot. It's, you know, where this photographer, he actually stood at that spot, and you know, it's a good spot in the town, of course, but to these men, they knew what it meant. And when that cenotaph went up, the feelings and the emotion in that town. And, you know, I will say this today for Headley, for a little town of perhaps 200 or so full-time residents, every Remembrance Day, over half the town attends. The seniors do hot rum and butter rum at the end of the service, and they give out tokens for it. And there's always at least 100 people and there's always a few more. People you won't see all year. They will come for the Remembrance Day. So, even though people have forgotten the stories of the Headley Boys, they haven't forgotten the Headley Boys. And I think that's the key thing with this podcast and everything is I just want people to, next time if you come through Headley and you stop at that, look at that, look at those men, and a little bit of what they went through and what they did.
So I hope you enjoyed that look at the Headley Boys podcast. 9 episodes that you can enjoy on all podcast platforms. Just go to headleyboys.com for more information and to learn about Andy. He puts together a fantastic podcast. I highly recommend it. If you want to, you can give me a rating and review, or you can give Andy a rating or review. Both of us would love it. It helps us move up the rankings on Apple Podcasts. If you want, you can reach me at craig@canadaehx.com. You can find hundreds of articles on Canada's history, as well as all of my podcast episodes on my website at canadaehx.com. And you can support the podcast for as little as $3 a month. Just go to patreon.com/canadaehx, just like all of these wonderful patrons have. Aaron O'Hara, Robert Dunseith, Todd Casey, Catherine Roy, Luke S., Vic Hedges, J.P. Bear, Jason Hall, Phil Maynard, Spencer M., Renee Beliveau, and Iris Gray. Thanks, and we'll see you again next time.